Hello and welcome to another episode of Earth911's Sustainability in Your Ear. Of course, we're talking in the midst of the coronavirus outbreak, and so we've got lots of time, and we're going to look carefully today at resilience, particularly resilience in communities and in building our homes. And we're joined today by Aris Popadopoulos, who's the founding chair of the Resilience Action Fund, which you can find on the internet at www.buildingresilient.com. Aris, welcome to the show. How are you today?
Thank you, Mitch. Appreciate you inviting me to the show. I'm doing very well, thanks.
Well, we have been reading with interest your warnings about what's coming in the spring with regard to flooding and other extreme weather. This is an unusual spring, obviously, but we should keep in mind that over the last 18 to 20 years, there have been about 6,200 deaths in the United States and more than $830 billion in economic losses from floods, extreme weather, and other forms of environmental impact on our lives. What do we need to be thinking about as we go into the spring of 2020, other than the coronavirus, with regard to the safety and resilience of the structures we live in?
Well, Mitch, it's never been more important than ever in the year we're in and the times we're in to think about how important the safety of our homes and communities is. And I kind of connect this to the current crisis we have with the virus and the fact that we're being told to stay at home, to not get out unless we need essential purchases. That safety of our home, which, at one time, we used to call our home is our castle, is so important, because imagine if something, and just recently we had the Utah earthquake, happens in our community. Where do we go? Where can we be safe? Do we evacuate? Do we go to community shelters? And, what's going to happen to us there? So, investing and taking care of our home today is more relevant than ever, and that extends to our community.
Now, this year, we're looking at coming out of 2019 was the second wettest year in history, and you're worried in particular about flooding. Can you tell us about the projections for flooding on the Mississippi, Missouri, and Red Rivers this coming spring?
Well, nobody can project with accuracy. But, a lot of the projections show that rainfall is on the rise, and that's the primary cause of flooding in the river basins, and the Mississippi Basin and Missouri Basins are the biggest of those in the U.S. So, anything that, predicts a heavy rainfall has to worry us. So I keep that in mind. We have to be prepared for the worst and for the unexpected.
Well, is resilience really about understanding and being prepared for the unexpected? I mean, when we talk about this, a lot of the times we end up speaking only in situations of crisis. And you are working to inform people about the importance of building standards, of improving those building standards. You point out that essentially housing is built to the least possible standard in order to make it the most affordable. But that means that a lot of times people are moving into homes which are not well protected from flood or from storm. How's the Resilience Action Fund engaged with communities to help people understand? Are you working primarily with policymakers, or do you do outreach to ordinary homeowners and business owners?
Well, I spent a career before retiring more than 5 years ago in the construction industry. So I saw up front the difficulties and the challenges of raising the standards. And it's a little bit of a chicken and egg situation, in that the biggest resistance to raising the standards for how we build our homes and our communities comes from the builders themselves. And the reason for that is they see it as a cost. In other words, a higher standard will mean, a higher cost of construction. And the problem is that the consumer, which is all of us, does not value that strength, does not value that resilience today. And we're not willing to pay more for it. And therefore, the builder sees it as a loss. Different from how we view today, let's say, safer cars or organic products or green products, where we appreciate the value of something better, and we're willing to pay a little extra for that because we see that it benefits us. We're not doing that with our communities and homes. And to me, that's a primary focus of Resilience Action Fund. I've termed it consumer-driven resilience because I believe that for something to be sustainable, it's got to be practiced by the consumer. And the consumer can drive the supply chain if they value it and are willing to ask for it.
Well, there's certainly ample evidence of that right now, because we can see entire industry shutting down because consumers have simply stopped purchasing what they make. And I've never seen a better example of evidence that small decisions by individuals make a huge difference to the economy. How can we take the moment of clarity that we have right now and talk in terms of the full life cycle cost of a house? Not simply the cost of construction and moving in, but the maintenance and, in many cases, rebuilding of that house because it wasn't built to specifications that would prevent damage or serious damage during a storm or an earthquake. Is that something that, given where we are right now, you think it's time for us to have a different kind of conversation about the full cost of a home and building and supporting a community over time, rather than just at the moment the house is for sale and somebody's considering buying it?
Yeah, indeed. We have not really understood the full cost of living through a disaster. But I think those individuals who go through that experience, and it is a difficult, very difficult experience, realize how many things affect their lives and indirectly affect their pocketbooks, let's say, from the time they waste to the fact that insurance doesn't cover everything and government support just doesn't cover everything, to the effect on their health, their well-being, their work, and many other things that add up. Unfortunately, very little research gets done in this specific topic of how the consumer, let's say, the individual bears this experience. Most of the research is done either at the government level or at the insurance company level, but not at the individual consumer level. So that's lagging, and something I'm trying to stimulate and encourage more research through my nonprofit, but very little work is out there to kind of show that information. And yet, when we think in common sense terms, we realize how dependent we are on our home. Our home is the center, is the most important investment we make in our lives, and for most people is the center of our wealth. Most people don't have the financial diversity of stock portfolios and other investments. Their wealth is their home and the possessions in that home. And that's especially true for the lower income classes. And when we trap them in this low standard that we've set for our society, I feel that we trap them in a vicious cycle of disaster and poverty. And that's what we need to realize. In other words, the path toward social equity has to go through resilience, has to provide people with a safe home. That's the building block of wealth.
So tell us about what the Resilience Action Fund is doing. You have programs in education, action, you make films, and you provide research. How can people use your site to begin to understand the kinds of issues they should be taking into account as they think about buying or relocating or even selling their home and helping the next owner make sure that it is going to be good for them?
I'll give you one example because I'm very excited about this project we're currently have underway, and it's in collaboration with another nonprofit. We're aiming to develop the first of its kind, and I'm tentatively calling it the Resilient Smart Home Buyer's Guide. And this will be an online tool that a potential home buyer can look at and get a quick education, depending on the location they're at, as to what things they should be looking at when they're studying which neighborhood to move into, or within that neighborhood, weighing the pros and cons of different houses. And I like to make it like as if you're talking to a knowledgeable uncle or friend who kind of give you some pointers and say, look, in this area, watch out for this, this, and this. Pay attention to these things. For example, if you're in a coastal area, you don't want to be buying things that are in a floodplain. You don't want to be buying a home that's in a designated flood zone. But even if it's not in a designated flood zone, the data shows that over a third of the flood-related losses happen outside of the flood zone. So how do you know if something outside of a flood zone is vulnerable? Well, there are sources of information that consumers can easily go to get that, and we want to help them. We want to give that to them in a easy to use site where they can first know how to become their own best screeners and detectives, let's say, resilience detectives, and second, ask the right questions. Because the property industry, the realtors and others typically won't volunteer this to you. Unless you are insistent and going after it, you will not normally get this this information offered to you. So that's one of the programs I'm very excited about.
Now, so you mentioned flooding. What are the other major hazards that a homeowner needs to be aware of as they start investigating the resilience of a location?
Well, Mitch, the four big hazards, and this comes from insurance kind of statistics, 85% or so of the economic losses are caused by wind, water, fire, or earthquakes, which I also call seismic. So if you focus on those four, and all locations have fire risk. Now, if you're in a urban wildlife interface, you've got to be even more concerned these days about fire. But all locations face fire risk. Many locations face water risk, whether that's flooding or water, just rainfall type risk, and the type of roof you have is very important. And many locations face wind, the hurricane-prone coasts of the Atlantic and the Gulf, the tornado-affected areas in the center of the country and elsewhere, and many areas, the whole West Coast and some areas even in the East Coast are affected by seismic. So, you've got to look at some areas, at least 3 of those 4 or even 4 of those 4 are things that you need to focus on. Now, there may be others such as landslide and things like that, or volcanic activity, but those are in the 10 or less percent. But I'd say if you focus on those 4 hazards, you've covered most of the risk.
Well, having actually lived through a volcanic eruption, it does happen, but it isn't something that's going to be threatening very many people. Now, another thing that you looked at, and I read with some interest on your site, is commentary about whether or not sustainable or green houses are actually resilient. Are we building green homes with an appropriate attention to their ability to withstand these severe weather events?
Unfortunately, we haven't, and we've taken kind of the silo approach, I feel, to the whole, sustainable building topic. The green movement obviously has been active for a couple decades and has made a lot of advances and progress, but has not really embraced the resilience and the importance of resilience strong enough. And I feel now with climate and with the need for adaptation, they're kind of looking at it more seriously. But, I run into a lot of people that kind of say, okay, this wall, we're going to build a green wall, therefore it's resilient. And I say, well, wait a second. Yes, the wall is green, but can it withstand the wind or water or whatever hazard you have here? And if the answer is no, then it's not really sustainable. It's not resilient, it's not sustainable. So in my view, for something to really be sustainable, it has to be both green and resilient. And we need to give, I say, equal emphasis to resilience. I like to say that before you become green, please become resilient first. Because, when we do something green, like a solar panel and so forth, and it's destroyed, it's a double loss. We've lost both the original investment and the additional green investment. So please be resilient first.
Yeah, we want our investments to be enduring, and that really is one of those challenges that becomes starkly clear in the environment we're in right now with coronavirus. I guess in these times, it's a hard question to ask, but can we count on government to back us up when our resilience fails? Is that something that you have been looking at?
Well, unfortunately, government to a large extent has been in a reactive mode, responding to disasters and situations rather than a proactive mode. I mean, they've recently kind of started trying to do more proactive things. but it's definitely not enough. I mean, it's still 90% reactive and maybe less than 10% proactive. And unfortunately, at the local level, where really a lot of these decisions are made. I mean, a lot of our codes are really locally approved, locally kind of administered and so forth. Things are even more lax. And, part of the dilemma we have locally, as governments, is that a lot of the revenue of local government depends on the property industry.
Sure.
And
Sure.
Therefore, governments are afraid to scare investment and scare values and, say anything, that might risk that. And in fact, a lot of governments approve projects that are very marginal from a resilience point of view. They're still approving projects in floodplains,
Mm-hmm.
Yes, as a developer, I can get an engineer and, I can put together a plan to, move the water and so forth. And, I can sell the community, the commissioners or whoever I'm talking to on the fact that I'm bringing jobs, I'm going to improve the tax base, and I'm also going to contribute to community facilities and things like that and get my project approved. But, a lot of these standards are so low that they don't really account for the severity of the hazards in that location. And who ends up paying for it? Well, obviously the consumer and the community as a whole in the end pay for it. So, we've got to get out of this cycle somehow. And to me, again, it boils down to educating the consumer. And I think we're starting to see in some markets where the consumers are starting to wake up. They're looking at properties on the coastline. They're saying, well, wait a second, maybe this is not worth as much as the seller is trying to get, because I'm going to have to do X, Y, and Z, elevate the property, improve the seawall, do a whole bunch of other things to defend it. And we're seeing some of those properties being heavily discounted, essentially losing value. And I think that's going to be the long-term trend for vulnerable properties.
So is there a way for a consumer to really understand where the vulnerable properties in their region are?
Well, I like to say that 70 to 80%, let's say, of the resilience is achieved at the time of purchase. And the other, let's say 20, 30%, is achieved after that,
Right.
And there's two dimensions to that. The first is the location, and the second is the type of building. So, location-wise, depending on the hazard, obviously flood being the most location-specific hazard, you've got to look at elevation. I mean, that's the key parameter there.
Right.
How far above the water level, whether that water is the sea, the ocean, or the river, or the lake, the property is. And I like to use as a rule of thumb, and this is just from my own personal kind of, empirical experience, anything below 15 feet elevation, worry about it, be careful,
Really?
And I moved, I live in Miami. I used to live on the beach for over a decade, and I moved 8 years ago to the west side of the bay, Biscayne Bay, and settled where the original settlers had, settled when they came down to this part of Florida at about 15 feet elevation, which is a mountain from Miami,
But you actually went back to the human observation that said, let's go to high ground.
Exactly.
And that's interesting. So the original settlers in Miami recognized they were moving onto a floodplain. That's very interesting. Now, what would you suggest, and Miami is an excellent example of this, what should the city do to be more prepared and to prepare its citizens in their homes for the next major catastrophe, whether that's sea level rise or hurricane or wind events?
Well, I'm very close to Miami, and I talk quite a bit with the policymakers here, Miami Beach being kind of what I call ground zero for all of this. They have invested already over $500 million in projects, elevating streets and adding pumps. But unfortunately, they've done this without a long-term vision in mind. They haven't really developed a long-term vision, and it's mainly been a reaction to the publicity they were getting about flooded streets 8-9 years ago on magazines and articles and things like that, and they wanted to stop those pictures, in those articles, because it wasn't good for business and property. But I've been encouraging them to develop the long-term vision. In other words, what might Miami Beach look like 50 years from now or toward the end of this century? Are we going to have private cars on Miami Beach? Or not? And I personally believe that we cannot afford to have private cars in Miami Beach. We're going to have mass transportation and supply routes, and we can't afford to raise all the small streets. We may end up with canals. So, creating this vision, and I've encouraged them to develop kind of an international almost, because these cities like Miami, Miami Beach, they're international cities in the sense that the future buyers, owners, investors, visitors are not here today. They're somewhere else, in another part of the country or in other countries. And so it's important that this process of creating a vision kind of be a expanded one. And I've encouraged them to organize an international competition of ideas as to what this vision might be. These are difficult decisions, and when a community has to face the possibility of flooding and damage to properties, there's no real good reference points. But when you look at the case of Miami Beach, they've been talking about expanding this initial projects to other neighborhoods of Miami Beach that have single-family homes. And the residents have kind of stood up and say, no, we don't want this. We don't want our houses to be at a lower elevation than the street. What's going to happen to our houses in a flood situation or a surge situation? And what if your pumps don't work? And they're right,
It's certainly a fair question.
Yeah, it's a fair question. So they have stopped some of these projects from continuing. And the issue is, when you go about trying to do this thing in a patchwork way, I call it almost like bandage, adding bandages without a long-term vision as to where you might end up, people can't see the big picture and they can't connect the dots. And that's what we're seeing today in Miami Beach. So I think the experience Miami's facing will be a lesson for many communities around the country. I used to live in Norfolk, Virginia years ago, and I kind of complimented the policymakers there of the city of Norfolk for basically producing a map and saying, we are going to invest in community facilities only in those areas that we think will survive. In other words, in the low-lying areas of Norfolk, we're not going to put more community facilities. We're not going to invest there. Obviously, that sends a strong signal to the community as to which areas will remain valuable and which will lose value. And it's a difficult message to send, but they sent it. And
they also addressed the compensation problem for many of the owners of the land that is disadvantaged. And it's really inspiring to see Norfolk, which is also in a very conservative and resistant to government intervention kind of community, investing so heavily. But it also is incredibly pragmatic. Mm-hmm. How do you translate the hard truth into a pragmatic action is, I think, the real question. And so with Miami and working with the builders and working with the community, is it simply a matter of deciding that there are parts of town that we are going to move away from, and that if there are losses involved in that decision, those losses also need to be accounted for by everybody in the community?
Some of it is essentially at the government level. The government has to decide, it doesn't have infinite resources and money, how and where it's going to prioritize its funding and its projects, and where it's, what the lower priorities are. And I don't underestimate the role of the private sector in this whole picture. In other words, if you have a vision for the future, and if that vision is kind of broadly communicated, it's more likely that you're also going to encourage private investment,
right,
in doing things. For example, we've seen in the last 6 months here in Miami, very beautiful floating, homes, kind of being positioned in the bay. Now, some people are alarmed, they're going to, put this floating home in front of my view and so forth. But, this is a possible solution for the future. Obviously, the role of government is to designate, okay, where should these type of homes be located? Which, parts of the city or the waters do we designate as, floating home locations, and plan ahead, and obviously the investment would be private there. And there are many other similar things. So, innovation, technology, entrepreneurship, all these things are possible, but you need to have a vision and a framework to, kind of offer a template as to where all this is headed to encourage that. And that's what I'm hoping that Miami Beach initially and Miami as a whole will develop.
Well, Aris Popadopoulos, thanks very much for joining us. I think it's a great place to stop. I'd encourage everybody to check out buildingresilient.com. It's a nonprofit that Aris has founded and runs. And there's a lot of great information here, including halls of fame and shame in terms of participation. There's also the best navigational button I've seen in a while: buy, read books. I congratulate you on encouraging people to read, Aris. But check it out. His book about building resilient community is available on the site. And if you purchase it, will also be a nonprofit contribution. So folks, do check it out. Aris, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you, Mitch, and appreciate you bringing this to your audience.
Well, everybody, this is Earth911's Sustainability in Your Ear. We'll be back with another interview soon, and have a wonderful and safe day. Take care.